Welcome everyone, my name is Brendan Snyder. Thank you so much for joining me. This is Top 5 Glam Metal Albums of 1994. And so these artists and their sound, they stood against the changing tides that were going on at the time in the music industry and the sound, and gave us some of the last great glam metal albums of the era. But before we dive into all of this, if you are new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please click the button. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And by subscribing, as an added bonus, you'll be able to stay up to date on all that's going on in the world of music, just like this, with the top 5 glam metal albums of 1994. And before we jump into it, I've got 2 honorable mentions I'd like to go through. First one up is Taiketo, Strength in Numbers. This album here was their second studio album, and it featured former Wasted vocalist Danny Vaughan. So Wasted being the band of from Pete Way, and the product that he was in, post UFO. So that's where he comes from. And the other one is Bang Tango, Love After Death, third studio album from these guys, and it was the last one to feature the original lineup of the band. Lead vocalist Joe Lissette would go on to play with Beautiful Creatures, which is a short-lived early 2000s era band. They got a little bit of notoriety and got some coveted gigs playing shows like with Ozfest and stuff like that. Ultimately, though, Joe Lissette would reactivate Bang Tango, and they are still going today. All right, so kicking off the top 5 glam metal albums of 1994, and coming in at number 5, we have Love Hate and Let's Rumble, third studio album from these guys, and it was actually recorded and released in the UK in 1993, but they weren't able to secure a US record deal until 1994. And so the album's sound is a continuation of the first 2 albums, albeit a little more raw and rough around the edges. Lead single Spinning Wheel, though, became a little bit of a hit, though, out in the LA area. However, due to complications with the record label, they weren't fully able to capitalize on its success. They did later sign to another record label and release the album, but by then, unfortunately, the popularity of the song had passed. Unfortunately, this is all too common as part of the history with Love Hate. These kind of things happening to them. They are a classic example of a would've, should've kind of band. Still, though, lead vocalist Jizzy Pearl has managed to make quite a name for himself, and he's fronted some of the biggest names of bands within the LA scene, like LA Guns, Rat, and Quiet Riot, just to name a few. All right, coming in at number 4, we've got Great White, Sail Away, 7th studio album, and this one here was a much more subdued, mellow effort from their previous blues, party rock kind of albums that they had been doing in the late 80s and early 90s. And while some bands tried to keep up with the changing times and add elements of grunge and alternative rock and things like that, Great White actually did the opposite to it. They instead stripped down to the bare essentials, making an acoustic album. Now, remember though, MTV Unplugged was all the rage at the time, so it does make sense that they would do this. And it was an album that, really should have gone over like gangbusters, but that's the industry for you. They didn't pay it any, mind at the time. The album itself does feature a bonus disc, at least at the time of release, called Anaheim Live, and it features, tracks that, so even if you weren't all for the acoustic thing, it had the rock and live performance along with it, which also featured their coveted cover of the Led Zeppelin song Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, which was first made famous during their performance on MTV Unplugged. Yes, Great White did play MTV Unplugged. Surprise success that came from that song, I think, is probably what prompted them to making this album here. Okay, and coming in at number 3, we've got David Lee Roth, Your Filthy Little Mouth, 4th solo album from him, the former Van Halen frontman. This album didn't fit the musical sounds at the time, grunge, alternative rock, that sort of stuff, but it also didn't fit people's expectations of Roth either. He had stripped away most of the flair that he had on his 3 previous albums, But that's not to say there weren't key elements on this, still making it a Roth album. It had the swagger, the tongue-in-cheek lyrics, and the full-on good times party vibe that he was known for. And so while it didn't connect with the general public at the time, I do think that this album itself has held up better than some of his other material on his earlier works. And it is an album that I feel is more straightforward rock with less flashy guitar, although the guitar is still amazing on here. It's the first album, though, where Roth, I think, wasn't competing with the other musicians for dominance within the song itself. The album itself gave breathing room to let Roth be Roth, and so I actually think that was a good thing for this album. Coming in at number 2, Cinderella, Still Climbing, 4th studio album by these guys, and unfortunately the last one for them as well, at least so far. This was also the first album without original drummer Fred Coury, who had left to join former Rat vocalist Stephen Pearcy in Arcade, put out an excellent album in 1993. For the drum duties on this album here, we got Kenny Aronoff handling those, and coming from most notably having played with John Mellencamp. But he's a big session guy who plays around with everyone, did a fantastic job on the album. Like previous album, though, they were moving away and stripping away those leftover glam metal elements and more emphasizing the blues rock sound and the more mature style sounds and things that they had been developing on the previous album. So this one here is still a real good, dirty, gritty hard rocker, and very much in the vein of like a good 70s hard rock album, which is really what Cinderella always were. And one of the things I really liked about this album here was that they dusted off some of the older songs for inclusion, you know, from back in the day. So the song Talk Is Cheap is actually a song that was first played live back in 1987. And then Freewheelin', that's one that they demoed back in 1985. And of course, Hot and Bother is included on here, coming from the Wayne's World soundtrack in 1992. All of these, I think, helping to give this album a more classic feel. And so while Tom had had some vocal problems leading up to the recording of the album, by the time that it was actually recorded, and that is part of what delayed the album itself, he was as good as ever vocally on this thing. Unfortunately, though, this would be the last new material from Tom for almost 20 years until he released his first solo album in 2013. But since that time, Tom has been going very strong. He's always on the road. He's put out 2 solo records, and he promotes them nonstop, 4 to 5 years apiece on each of those. All right, we're down to the number 1 spot, and coming in at that position, Motley Crue and their self-titled release, sometimes referred to as 1994. So this one here is their 6th studio album, once again produced by famed producer Bob Rock, now even more famous, having worked with Metallica on the Black Album in between Motley Crue's Dr. Feelgood and this album here. This was also their first album of new material in 5 years, and first without founding member vocalist Vince Neil. So now they've got coming in for the vocal position John Corabi, formerly of the Scream, and with him in tow, they were actually able now to feature a 2-guitar format, and the band explored new territory on this album due to that. With it, though, changing and modernizing with the times, and they always did this a little bit on all of their albums. This one probably a bit more than past albums. It became heavier and darker at times, which I think alienated longtime fans, but I actually think that it gives the album quite a bit of depth, and John Corabi himself, he does an amazing job vocally on this album. The album itself all too often is overlooked simply because Vince Neil is not part of it, but John Corabi really stepped up. He was a fantastic foil for the rest of the guys in the band, and I think he took the band in a new direction. And so while the album itself not as successful as previous albums, it still was certified gold, and that was quite an accomplishment in 1994 for a former glam metal band like Motley Crue. And I say that because this is a band that really elevated themselves above that and moved beyond it the same way bands like Def Leppard and Guns N' Roses, all bands that started out in the glam metal era, but really elevated themselves above and beyond. And so Motley Crue certainly did that, and there you go. Tango. That is the top 5 glam metal albums of 1994. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Don't forget to check the description below for links to other related videos, and I'll put a few links to the other top 5 glam metal album videos that I've done in the past. Hopefully, again, you guys enjoyed this, and if you did, please remember to comment, like, and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts. I hope everyone has a great day, and I'll talk to you all soon. Bye, everyone.